Clear. Okay. So today's daf is daf zayin. We're going to start on the bottom of Vav Amud Bet with the words V'tefach hechan ma'amido. Okay. Ve'oto tefach hechan ma'amido. So because the question is like this, we know that the halacha is whether, according to Rabbi Shimon, who says you need 3 walls plus a partial fourth wall, or according to the Chachamim, which we follow, that you need only 2 complete walls plus an additional tefach. The question is, what do you mean an additional tefach? Where do you put the tefach? Where do you put that extra board of tefach? Tefach is this amount. Where do you put this amount? This tefach. So the Amar Rav says, "Ma'amido keneged hayotzeh." Rav says you put it by the yotze, by the part going out. Now what does he mean? There's a nice illustration here. I don't know which version you have in your art scroll. I'm using this one. Probably have the same. Oh, it has that kind. See, I don't like the 3D. I like this. Yeah. Anyway, but this drawing in the Rashi shows you what it means is this little tefach. In other words, you have 2 walls that are shaped like an L. And then you have a little bit of a tefach on one side, jutting out. So it's like you have a little bit jutting out. That's what Rav says, that's all you need. You need a little bit jutting out on that third side. And that's what Rav says. But in the end, there are other opinions. We don't necessarily follow that. Amrei le Rav Kana v'Rav Asi le Rav. So Rav Kana and Rav Asi said to Rav, V'yamidenu keneged rosh tor. Why can't you make it keneged rosh tor? What does that mean? It means like the furrow in the ground. The furrows on the ground would be in a diagonal. So if you take a look at the Rashi on the top again, he shows you what that would mean. That it means that you have again an L shape, and then on one side of the L, in other words, on one extremity, let's say call this the northwest side, you point it southwest, or this is northeast, right? So you point it northwest, or if it's facing this way, if the end is to the east, is northeast, so then you would have it facing southwest. In other words, it's on a diagonal. So they asked, instead of just having it jut out straight, why don't you have it because then it closes in a little bit, right? It looks like it's closing in a little bit more. Maybe that should be better. That seems like it would be a little bit longer and a little bit better. So he said, Shatik Rav did not answer them. Okay? So he didn't answer them. They asked him, why don't you do that? He didn't say anything. He says it just has to be straight. It doesn't have to be on any kind of an angle like that. So now, Itmar was stated, Itmar Namir, Amar Shmuel Mishmei de Levi. Shmuel said in the name of Levi, Mamido keneged hayotze. Same thing as Rav originally said. You just put it on the end that's open. V'chein morin bei midrasha. This is what they taught in the Beit Midrash. Mamido keneged hayotze. That's where you put it. Rabbi Simon v'itema Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Amar. Rabbi Simon, and some say it was Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, said, Oselo tefach sochek. You should make it a smiling tefach. What does that mean? It means a tefach that is holding the fingers apart. It's a little bit wider than a regular tefach. It's a little bit more. Expanded. Yeah, a little expanded. And umamido bepachot mishlosha tefachim samuch ledofen. And you put it within 3 tefachim of the wall. V'chol pachot mishlosha samuch ledofen kalavud damei. And anything which is within 3 tefachim to the wall is lavud. It's solid. So what does he mean to say? Like this. Here's the illustration in Bet. In Rashi, what you have is you have this piece that's a little bit more than a tefach, and you put it within 3 tefachim of the wall. So that means that this whole section, even though it looks like empty space, is actually considered wall.
But
right?
It comes out looking like a post standing out there.
Right. What happens is, since it's close enough, this is all considered wall. Why is that significant? Why do you want to do it that way? Very simply, Rashi explains, because that means that since less than 3 tefachim is considered enclosed, plus you have a tefach and a little bit more, what do you have? 4 tefachim. Because you have a little bit less than 3 tefachim of space, and a little bit more than 1 tefach of board. So that equals about 4 tefachim. And 4 tefachim is the majority of the 7 tefachim, which is the minimum for a sukkah wall. Because remember, we talked about 7 and a little bit. 7 and a little bit by 7 and a little bit. Tefachim is the minimum length and width of the sukkah. So now we have a wall that meets the minimum the majority of the minimum requirements. So according to this version, you can't just put a tefach of a board on the end like that we thought before. It has to be that you have a space on that third side, which is the majority of a wall, of a minimum wall. which is 4 tefachim. And the way you create it is, yes, with only a tefach of solid, and with less than 3 tefachim of space, you can call that a wall of 4 tefachim, and therefore you have a majority of a wall. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Sukkah Suya kemavui keshera. Not only can you do it this way, where you have the L-shaped 2 walls, and then on the third side you make a little bit, but you can have Sukkah Asuya kemavui. What's a mavui? We learned a mavui is an alleyway, which means all it has is a wall on this side and a wall on this side. A wall to the west, a wall to the east. There's nothing in the north and south. Okay, like in the drawing Gimel. Drawing Gimel is, you just have 2 parallel walls. That's it, 2 parallel walls, nothing else in between. They're not touching each other. So you can do that too. You can make that a sukkah. How are you going to make that a sukkah? And you just have to put the tefach on any side that you want. That's what he says. Rabbi Simon, ve'itema Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi amar. Rabbi Simon, and some say it was Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, disagree. They said a tefach is not good enough for a situation like that. Ozelo pas arba'a u'mashu, u'ma'amido bepachot mishlosha samuch ledofen. V'chol pachot mishlosha samuch ledofen, kalavud dami. What you must do for a case like this is take not a tefach wide board, not a board that's a tefach wide, and just stick it on one of the sides. Why? Because you have 2 parallel walls with nothing in between. And you're just going to put like 1 tefach on one side. That's not enough. What do you need to do? You need to take a board that's 4 tefachim wide. Okay, that's about a foot wide. Okay, let's say approximately about a foot wide, and you have to put it within 3 tefachim of one of the walls. What do you have now? 7. Right? Before we said you had to create 4, so you had a tefach within 3 tefachim of the wall. Now we're saying you need 7. Why 7? Because 7 is the minimum amount for a wall. So for this situation, since the 2, now the Gemara asks, before I preempt the question, why did you tell me when it comes to an L shape, 2 walls that are touching, all you need on the third side is 1 tefach, and it has to be a 1 tefach wide board within 3 tefachim of the second wall. And why, when it comes to a mavoi, do you need 4 tefachim wide? Hatam deika shete defanot kilchatan sagile batefach sochek hachad deleka shete defanot iika pasar ba'ain lo. This is, I can explain it to you. I could have explained it to you before reading it. You probably see the answer coming. In other words, why is there a difference? Because when you have an L shape, you already have 2 walls that are connected to one another. Defanot kilchatan. Walls that are halachically acceptable. And what do you need to do? Add something on. But when you just have 2 parallel walls, they're not touching. It's a mavoi. There's no structure. What's the connection? So to create a sense of structure, you need a board that is 4 tefachim wide, within 3 tefachim of one of these walls, as they have illustrated here. Here they have illustrated actually, but it's within 3 tefachim of both of the walls. But it could be either one. It says it could be either one, and that gives you 1 full wall. So even though there's space maybe on one of the sides, it's okay.
Could you just explain the reasoning that they give for that it's okay to have 1 tefach in 1 wall? What's the reasoning that they give?
What do you mean? What 1 tefach?
Well,
they separated the tefach from...
seems to say that you can have 2 parallel walls and then 1 tefach and it's okay. What's his reason?
No, it's not. It's 4.
No, Rabbi Yehuda said that. He's right.
He says that.
He said that. So it seems like his logic. It doesn't. The Gemara doesn't go into his logic because it wasn't accepted. The view wasn't accepted. But it seems like his logic is that it's like a mavoi, because on Shabbat you have a mavoi. Right. You have an alleyway, and you're allowed to carry in the alleyway with just.
So when it's a mavoi,
tefach, you have a lechi.
Is a mavoi.
Well, that's going to come up. It's going to come up on the next amud. Next amud. So, according to him, that's sufficient. All you need is the 2 walls and the 1 tefach. But the other chachamim said, no, you need, since these 2 walls have no connection to one another, there's no structure. You need to have a 4 tefach wide board, a foot wide, within 3 tefachim of one of these walls, so you have a real something.
That seems to be the consensus.
That's a consensus, yeah. Rabbi Yehuda wasn't accepted. Rava says, Rava said, and now according to Rashi, this is going back to the original case. The case where you have the 2 walls in an L shape. That you can't just have 2 walls in an L shape and a tefach that is within that is within 3 tefachim of the side. There has to be tzurat hapetach. There has to be a form of a door. Now Rashi says on the side, be'eruvin. We talk about tzurat hapetach means kadne mikan ve'kane mikan ve'kane al gabehen. We always, the form of a door is like how you make what we call an eruv today, right? You have a stick, a vertical stick, horizontal stick going over the top. Right, that's the definition of tzurat tefach. Now, what's the relevance here? So Rashi says, what do you have to do with that tefach? What you need to do is you take half of a tefach of board and you put it close to the side, close to one of the doors, close to one of the walls, rather. And then you have to put on top of it a vertical board, a vertical stick, and another half tefach of a horizontal thing, and then another half tefach of vertical piece. So this is what Rashi says on the side. He says, so what do? You put the half of a tefach next to one of the walls. And then what do? You make a tzurat petach, you make a form of a door, and you put the other half of a tefach. So he's disagreeing with what we said up till now. Okay, Rav said all you need to do is put a tefach. You have the L-shaped wall, just put a tefach on one side next to the second wall, and it's good enough. Then they said, no, that's not good enough. You need to move it within 3 tefachim of the side, so that you have at least 4 tefachim that's considered closed. Okay? And then we talked about the case of the mavoy, but then we went back to that case. And Rava says, no. It's not enough to have just 1 tefach within 3 tefachim of that second wall. You need to, what you do is it's true that the Chachamim said that the third wall only needs to be a tefach. But what they meant was, take a board that's a tefach wide, slice it in half. Put half of it over here. Half of it is on next to the leg of the L. Let's say that leg of the L that goes from west to east in the picture here. We're calling this west and east. Okay, we're calling this north-south. Okay, so at the northeastern corner, you put that tefach, and then you want to make a tzurat pesach going south along the east side of this sukkah. Okay, what you do is you put a half a tefach by the northeastern side corner, and then you make a vertical board going across, and the other half a tefach over here at the southeastern point.
These drawings are obviously not to scale.
No, obviously not. No, but the point is that he's interpreting this whole idea that you can use a tefach to fix the third wall in a different way. Right. It doesn't mean you could just put a board that's a tefach either right next to that leg of the sukkah or 3 tefachim away from that point, that corner. You can't do that. You have to put you have to slice it in half. Half the tefach is by the leg of the L, and half the tefach is away from it, and then there's something on top of it. And now you have tzurat petach. What they meant was you could have 2 walls and a tzurat petach on the third wall.
In other words, you can't ever consider a tefach a wall. You can do something with it.
You can do something with a tefach board to make a wall. Tzurat petach. That's right. But it has to still have the substance of a tefach. Rava is saying according to this. In other words, it has to be because you have to have half a tefach on one end, half a tefach on the other.
So if it was a quarter of a tefach and a quarter of a tefach,
according to this version, no. But we're going to see that they're going to play with that. Okay. So, but so far no. Ika de Amri, some say Amar Rava v'niteret nami b'tzurat petach. Ika de Amri Amar Rava utzricha nami tzurat petach. Okay, there's 2 versions here. In other words, one version is that what he meant was you have 2 alternatives. Either you can do like what they said before, which is take a tefach board and have it within 3 tefachim of the second wall, and it will be like a third wall. Or it will be like the eastern wall of the sukkah in this diagram. Mm-hmm. Or you can take a rod of any size. It doesn't have to be a half a tefach. And a rod of any size, even a mashahu, and make it tzurat petach. It's either one or the other. It's either or. Or did he mean to say? So there's 2 possibilities. Either he meant to say you have 2 options, or he meant to say no, there's 1 option. You must use a tefach's worth of board, split in half, to make it tzurat petach, like we originally explained.
Right.
It's either one or the other. Okay, so there's two possibilities. Either you need the so actually in the end there's three possibilities, because there's possibility one is like we originally explained, half a tefach by the leg of the wall, half a tefach by the leg of the L, right? Half a tefach there, half a tefach spaced out, and something on top. That's the only thing you can do. That's one possibility. Or he meant you can either have you can either have a situation of a tzurat petach where there's no measurement, or you can have a tefach board separated by 3 tefachim, like we originally said, from the L. That's possibility number 2. Or what he meant was you need both. You need both. So that's what Rashi says. The third possibility is u'tzuchanami tzot petach is mashma detarbayu bainan tevach etzel yotze v'kaneh bezavit shekenegdo v'kaneh shal gabehen kaim tevach zelakaneh shal zavit. In other words, what you need is a tefach within 3 tefachim of the northeastern corner. Plus, you need to make another stick at the southeastern point and put something on top of them to make it tzurat petach. So essentially you have a combination of the two. So it's 3 possibilities. Either he's saying you have 2 options. Tefach within 3 tefachim of wall number 2, or tzurat petach where there's no minimum dimension of the boards. One or the other. Or what he meant was, yes, you need a tefach, but the only way you can do it is if you split the tefach in half and you make it tzurat petach, half a tefach close to the wall, half a tefach, at the southeastern point, and put something on top of them. Or, third possibility, it's a combination of the 2 ideas. You need to have a full tefach within 3 tefachim of the wall, which gives you that benefit of having a majority of a wall intact. And then you need to put a vertical board and have some kind of stick on the other end to make it tzurat petach. You need both. Okay? These are the 3 possibilities. And what happened was, Rav Ashi Ashkachei, the Rav Kahana, the Ka'avid Tefach Sochek, the Ka'avid Tzurat petach. That Rav Ashi found Rav Kahana who was doing a combination. He put a board that was a tefach wide, was a smiling tefach, an expanded tefach, within 3 tefachim of the second wall, and he made it tzurat petach. Amar le, he said to him, Lo savar mor leha de Rava. Don't you agree with Rava? Amar Rava v'niter nam b'tzurat petach. That Rava said all you need is a tzurat petach. You don't need to go this far. He said v'niter nami b'tzurat petach. You have the option of doing it even with 2 boards of no dimension necessary, with a vertical piece going on top. Amar le anakidach lishana de Rava svirali. Amar Rava utzichan nami tzurat petach. I hold like the third version of Rava, which is you need both. You need to have that board you need to have a board that is a tefach and a little bit more within 3 tefachim of the second wall, and that remaining space along the southeastern side has to be with tzurat petach. There you go. That's a perfect. Yeah, can you show that? That is the diagram of what he's talking about, and that's the conclusion. That is the halachic conclusion, indeed. Shtayim gil chatan. We said you need 2 halachic walls, and the Gemara says, and what's the correction here of Amar Rabbah? It should be Rabbah said v'chen the Shabbat. The same is true of Shabbat. Okay, migod havyadofen le'inyan sukkah, havyadofen le'inyan Shabbat. Just like we say that this structure that we're going to consider a sukkah is an enclosed area with regard to Hilchot Shabbat, with regard to Hilchot Sukkah. On the Shabbat of Sukkot, we are going to similarly consider this Sukkah a Reshut HaYachid, even though it may not meet the normal requirements on Shabbat for a private domain. How so? As Rashi says, Afal pi shetarich l'Shabbat shalosh mechitzot le'asot Reshut HaYachid, Shabbat shel Sukkot mutar lismoch al mechitzot HaSukkah im asa b'Reshut HaRabim samuch lepitcho. So he says that if a person makes a sukkah right outside their door, so they can walk right from their house into the sukkah. Now on a regular Shabbat, that sukkah that doesn't have a third wall, it only has a tefach, right, or whatever it has, some minimal kind of wall on the third side, it wouldn't necessarily, we're going to see, wouldn't necessarily be considered an enclosed area for purposes of Hilchot Shabbat. on a regular Shabbat. But since for Sukkah we consider it a structure, for Shabbat of Sukkot we likewise consider it a structure. As Rashi says, since you only have a tefach on that side, it would be considered problematic for the case of a normal case of Shabbat. Okay. But for the situation that we have, where it's Shabbat of Sukkot, there we're going to allow it. So
it's your house. You're living in it.
No, just because the Torah recognizes it.
That's what I mean.
As a structure for the purposes of Sukkot. Oh. So since the Torah, and that's
right, we're saying the same.
Right, it has to be. But on any other day, let's say it's after Sukkot, and you have that same structure. Since the Torah is no longer granting that the status of a Sukkah, it's not a structure anymore. And if it's parutz merubel haomed, if there's more open space than enclosed space, let's say for example you have two doors and the other two walls, and on the third wall you have one of these nifty solutions of just a tefach with a tzurat petach or whatever, or according to one of the other opinions, you just have a tefach, you don't even have a tzurat petach. So that certainly for Shabbat, hilchot Shabbat would not count. Okay, so because you have too much open space in the structure. So so that's what he says. So Abaye said, do we really say that since something is considered to be a structure for the purposes of Sukkot, we're going to apply the same rule to Shabbat? Ve'atani, we learned in a brayta, dofen Sukkah ke dofen Shabbat, that the wall of the Sukkah is like the wall of Shabbat. Ubilvad shelo yehe ben kanel havero shelosha tefachim. And he says that as long as there's not space in between one stick and the next one of 3 tefachim. V'yitera Shabbat al Sukkah, she'Shabbat eina niteret ela be'omed merubel parutz, ma she'en ken b'Sukkah. It says that Shabbat has a stricter rule than Sukkah, because Shabbat you must have omed merubel parutz. There has to be more wall than there is space in the structure. So it says on one hand, from Shabbat we learn the halacha that you can have vertical sticks going around an area with nothing going horizontally. Or you can have horizontal, 3 ropes. We learned about it in Masechet Eruvin. 3 ropes going across that are don't have much space in between them can be considered a wall, even though there's nothing horizontal vertical going down at any interval. Okay, you can have either of those things, even though there's space in between. That, just like it counts for Hilchot Shabbat as a mechitza, it also counts as a wall for Sukkah, as long as you don't have more than 3 tefachim in between the two things. So if you have just sticks that you put in the ground, and there's less than 3 tefachim in between them, even though there's nothing going across the top, there's nothing horizontal going across the top, it's still going to be considered a structure. As Rashi says, anything that the rabbis allowed for Shabbat, like these kinds of unusual all vertical or all horizontal kinds of structures, are considered to be walls also for a sukkah. Okay, as long as you have, the only difference is that when it comes to Shabbat, you have to have more solid than you have space. When you have sukkah, you don't have such a requirement. You don't have a requirement of more solid than you have space. So my love yitera Shabbat de sukkah asukkah velo amrinan migo. Doesn't this mean when it says Shabbat is more than sukkah, because Shabbat requires that the majority be enclosed physically, and sukkah doesn't that mean that even on the Shabbat of Sukkot, that sukkah is not considered reshut hayachid? In other words, you can live in the sukkah on Sukkot, on the Shabbat of Sukkot, but you couldn't carry, let's say, from your house into that sukkah, if the sukkah is adjacent to your house, like the door opens from your house into that sukkah, you couldn't carry, because it's in the Reshut HaRabim, and it's not considered a Reshut HaYachid. Isn't that what it's saying? It's saying that since that sukkah doesn't have the majority enclosed, it's halachically a sukkah, because it's made of tzurot petach. You have doorways, but for Shabbat it's not.
How about my patio? I get out of this and go to the sukkah.
You have enclosure, right? You have a fence. So you're good. But here we're talking about where it's wide open. In other words, you walk out, it would be the street, but you have a sukkah there. So that sukkah doesn't count as a reshut hayachid for Hilchot Shabbat. That's what it's saying, right? No, it doesn't mean that. Yitera Shabbat de alma al Shabbat de sukkah. What it means is that any other Shabbat, you're right. In other words, if you had a sukkah like this, that had a door on wall 1 and a door on wall 2, and the wall 3 is made of 1 tefach and a tzurat petach, you have 70% opening and 30% wall. On a regular Shabbat, you wouldn't be able to carry from your house into that sukkah. But on the Shabbat of Sukkot, because the Torah gives it the status of a structure, I don't think of it so much that way, because your house could be, you're homeless, you live on the street. If that's your house, it wouldn't be. The point is, since the Torah is giving this the status of a structure, of an enclosure, okay, right? But I mean, yeah, right. But since it's giving it, it's recognizing this as a valid structure. We can't call it a Reshut HaRabim anymore. We can't say it's Reshut HaRabim. As opposed to if a person lived in a cardboard box on the street, we wouldn't say, well, therefore, because it's your house, it's not Reshut HaRabim. Right. Sukkot is granted a certain status. If that's true, Sukkah Alma, Sukkah Shabbat, Tilu Sukkah Alma Baya Tefach Sochek, Tilu Sukkah Shabbat Lo Baya Tefach Sochek, V'Sagi Belachi. Then you should also mention, if that's what it means, why doesn't it also mention, in other words, if it's telling you that the Shabbat of Sukkot is different, because since the Sukkah has a unique halacha, that we recognize it as a structure even though it's lacking the requirement of having the majority enclosed, why don't we say the same thing? Why doesn't it also mention the opposite? That Sukkah of Shabbat, in other words, on the Shabbat of Sukkot, there is a leniency about Sukkah also. And where does it derive from? It derives from Hilchot Shabbat. What's the leniency about Sukkah? Wait, no, it didn't say it yet. That normally, what do you need for a third wall? You need a tefach and a tzurat petach to make that third wall. But the Sukkah of Shabbat doesn't require that. Because the halacha is that if you had a mavoi, you had 2 walls parallel to one another. It's an alleyway, and you put a lechi on one wall. Remember, you put lechi. You put just a vertical tefach or whatever it is on one side, on the right side, let's say, of the exit of the mavoi. That allows you to carry in the mavoi.
Yeah, but the lechi is only a reminder.
Well, there's a machloket in Masechet Eruvin if lechi is mishum mechitza or lechi is mishum hekera, whether it's because it's to remind you, it's because of mechitza. It's a machloket.
The lechi is just to remind you that
there was a discussion. There's a discussion about it, but even so, it doesn't matter. The point is that halachically,
it still makes it a practice.
Halachically,
for different reasons.
But it doesn't matter
because it makes it a structure.
Okay.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. The point is that halacha, because they grant this space now the status of Reshut HaYachid, so if you made it a sukkah, it would be good. So during the week of Sukkot, if you were to put sechach on the mavoi and say it's my sukkah, it's no good. Why? Because it's lacking on that third wall.
But then if that's the case, what's the point of even discussing the reasons? Because it seems that they're comparing it because of the reasons. In other words, they say that, however configuration it is, if the configuration is such a sukkah and it's considered a Reshut HaYachid, then it's, one way, so because that takes consideration of the reason why it's a Reshut HaRabim in each case. Right? But if you don't take that
but the whole chidush here, I would say that's the whole concept here. That's the whole novelty here. That the Gemara's chidush, so to speak, the new idea is that even though the reasons are totally different, right? In other words, the reason why a sukkah is considered a Reshut HaYachid on the Shabbat of Sukkot is not because of Hilchot Shabbat. It's because it's the house, like you said. It's because the Torah recognizes it as a structure that you're using for living. That's not the usual basis for defining a Reshut HaYachid.
Right.
Normally we'll look at the structure. Doesn't matter. So the same thing with the mavoi. Wait a second. If I were to make a sukkah out of 2 parallel walls and just a tefach little stick on one side, that wouldn't be a sukkah. But since it's a mavoi and halacha endows it with the status of Reshut HaYachid, once you put a lechi, the Chachamim said that's a Reshut HaYachid for Shabbat. I can't argue with them. It's a sukkah now.
But just
in other words, for the sake of consistency, just for that Shabbat. But if you go in there and Chol HaMoed Sukkot, you can't say a bracha. It's not a sukkah. It's a sukkah only for Shabbat. Why? That's the chidush here is that even though the reasoning is totally extraneous, Any time the halacha recognizes, just like when the halacha recognizes it as a structure, even though under the laws of Hilchot Shabbat it wouldn't be a structure, since the laws of Sukkah recognize it as a structure, it gets grandfathered in. And the same with the Mavoi.
My difficulty with this is that if that's the case, then why in the first place are you even compelled to compare it to a Mavoi?
When do you compare it?
Comparing it to a Mavoi.
When do you compare it?
You don't need to compare it. It's like it's two completely different things. Since at the end you're going to say, well, it's considered this way for a completely different reason, it's considered this way for a completely different reason. Why not say, okay, Sukkah and Mavoi are, completely separate?
They could have said that.
Right.
That's enough. The chidush of Rabbah, what he's trying to say is that that's what you would think.
Yeah.
That's what you would normally think. You would normally say, well, that's very nice that you can carry in there because it's lechi, but that doesn't mean it's a sukkah. The Hilchot Sukkah says the third wall has to be defined in a certain way.
It's not acceptable.
Right? It's not acceptable. You can carry in there in Shabbat because it has a lechi, but that doesn't mean it's a sukkah. That's what you would think. So the chidush here is that he's coming along to tell you that the Torah wants to has at any given time, there's only one definition of a structure, of an enclosed area. So if it's Sukkot, you can't have a situation where you have an internal contradiction. If for Shabbat that Mavoi is considered Reshut HaYachid, it also has to be considered a structure for Hilchot Sukkah for that day. And if for Sukkah this is considered a structure, for that Shabbat that has to be considered a structure. It's an amazing thing.
I guess probably because you tend to, because you're training your mind to think
categorically, universally. You have to, right.
I'm in the rabbis here are looking for any reason or excuse to make it easier to be able to.
And they're trying to unify things. They're also trying to unify. They're also trying to unify the halacha. They're trying to unify the halacha. They don't want to have a situation where you have different standards operating. Oh, for Shabbat that's not, but for Sukkot it is. For Sukkot it is. For Shabbat it's not. So
both of them count.
Right. So they're both good. It works both ways. So the question is, why didn't you bring the other case? Why did Rabbah only bring the case where Sukkah defines the Hilchot Shabbat? Why didn't he bring the case where the Shabbat, the Mavoi, the Lechi, defines Hilchot Sukkah for that Shabbat? Why did he mention that? The answer is because Ahulu it's Trichale. He didn't feel a need to mention it. Why? Because Ashta makilta lahamirta amrinan mehamirta lakilta lokol sheken. If the lenient case, in other words, if the Sukkah, which is lenient, it's only a mitzvat aseh, it's not a mitzvat lo ta'aseh, it's certainly not as strict as Hilchot Shabbat. If the Sukkah can redefine a Reshut HaYachid for that Shabbat, going from a lenient to the strict. In other words, Sukkah can overpower Hilchot Shabbat. Certainly, Shabbat laws, if we're going to be lenient about Mavoi on Shabbat, that halacha is going to overpower Hilchot Sukkah. So he didn't have to mention it. Gufa, let's go back to what we said up before. It should say Amar Rabbah again. Rabbah said, not Rabbah, but Rabbah, that what? Sichech al gabei Mavoi. Well, you mentioned the case of Sichech al gabei Mavoi, where you put Sichach on the Mavoi, where you have two parallel walls, sheyesh lo lechi, and it has a lechi. So in other words, it is a what we learned about in Eruvin, it has the one of the two ways that you can fix a Mavoi, which is putting a lechi there. So it's kshira, it's acceptable for a sukkah. Amar Rabbah, it should probably say again. And Rabbah furthermore said, Sikech al gabei paseh beraot kshira. Remember paseh beraot? We just talked about it a couple of days. We just jogged our memory of it a couple of days ago, but we'll jog it again. This is when they would have travelers who were coming for Aliyah l'Regel or whatever it was, and they would be caught on the road, and they had a well. And they can't take from the well, which is Reshut HaYachid, because it's in the ground, and it's lower than 10 tefachim. They can't take the water from the well into their encampment on Shabbat, because it's taken from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim. So what did the Chachamim do? They said all you need to do is make 4 corners. In each corner have an amma going this way, and an amma going this way, and on this have an amma going this way. So what you have is you have right angles at every corner, and there's a nice illustration. It's a very simple, basic my style illustration here, right? That basic illustration of the corners are covered that way. That's paseh beraot. You're allowed to carry there, even though you have much more space than you have structure, because in between the paseh beraot there's a lot of space. It doesn't matter. You can put zechach on top of the these paseh beraot, and you will have a sukkah. That's what it says. Okay, it says
It's only an emergency.
Yeah, that's an emergency. But if you are in that situation, in other words, if you're in that situation, you're traveling on the Shabbat of Sukkot, you made pasei bera'ot, put tzachach on it, it could be a sukkah. Why? Even though for hilchot sukkah there's too much space. I mean, what kind of sukkah is that? But still, since for Hilchot Shabbat, we're recognizing that as Reshut HaYachid.
Where would you put the schach?
I don't know. What? No, they just had to put boards. They just put boards. Boards, that's all. Just had to put boards at right angles, and they're able to make that little enclosure. And he says that each one has to be 4 tefachim, facing in each direction. So you end up having plenty of space. Although, if I remember correctly, earlier in the Masechet he said amma, but we have to check on that. But in any case, here he says 4 tefachim in Rashi.
So besides 4 on each wall or 4 for each one?
4 for each
one.
An
amma is 4. So that's 8 tefachim.
An amma is usually 6 tefachim.
Okay, so if you have...
You would have more than an amma in each wall.
Right, so then isn't that according to...
You either have 2 amot or you have an 8 tefachim.
Majority for a majority of a...
But you have more space you'll have more space than solid. That's the problem.
No, but I mean...
So they were lenient there.
I mean, how do you put schach on that?
I guess you would probably, what you'd do was, I'm guessing, but you would have very tall boards.
Okay, but
and you would just rest the schach on it.
Maybe put a frame around it.
I don't know what kind of schach there. I guess they'd put a frame on top or something.
Horizontal.
Okay. So
I mean, I don't know.
It's not just this.
Yeah, maybe they would make it into a Tzurat HaPetach type of thing, I guess.
There has to be something in here.
Yeah, to hold it.
To hold it.
Yeah, that I don't know. I don't know how they did it, but in any case, so he says, why does he need both cases with tzricha? Because it's the same concept. In other words, the fact that you can use the mavoi as chach, as a sukkah, and the fact that you can use pasei bera'ot, it's the same concept. Since the rabbis permitted this kind of makeshift enclosure on Shabbat to carry, so it's also good for sukkah. Why does he have to mention both? Because if we only knew mavoi mishum deika shetei defanot ma'aliyata, because you have 2 walls in a mavoi, so at least you have 2 walls. But you might say when it comes to the 2 wall, you don't have 2 walls in pasei bera'ot. You only have the corners. You have corner pieces, not walls. So maybe you'll say that's not good enough. And there, so maybe he should just mention the pasei bera'ot. That's more of a chidush because all you have is corner pieces and you can still use it. Maybe that's mishum dikasham arba defanot, but at least you have all 4 walls. There's something on all 4 sides. Even though it's makeshift, on all 4 sides there's something. But if you were to put it on top of the mavoi that you really only have walls on 2 sides, you will say no, it's not good enough. Therefore you have to mention both. And if we had only these 2 cases, but we didn't have the case where the sukkah is made of a tzurat petach and it's still considered to be permitted to carry in there on Shabbat, you might say, well, Hilchot Shabbat can override Hilchot Sukkah. In other words, since these pasei bera'ot, or since the mavoi, even though in the case of the mavoi, it's lacking 2 walls, and in the case of the pasei bera'ot, it doesn't have a complete wall on any of the 4 sides, still, since in Hilchot Shabbat, the rabbis allowed you to carry in those enclosures on Shabbat, therefore they are considered valid enclosures for Sukkah as well. However, you might have thought that a Sukkah, since it is more open space than solid space, and Sukkah is more of a lenient situation than Shabbat, you might have thought that the fact that Hilchot Sukkah endorses such a structure like that, where 70% of the wall is open space, doesn't necessarily mean that for Hilchot Shabbat we are going to recognize that Sukkah as Reshut HaYachid. Therefore, Rabbah had to also mention that case.
No, but it discusses within the context of first having 2 walls and then that. It doesn't discuss it in the context of having all of the walls.
What do you mean?
Yeah, go ahead.
What all the walls? What do you mean?
All of the walls being opened like this. When it,
No, what he's saying is he's giving you 2 cases where Hilchot Shabbat is lenient, and we take the leniency of Hilchot Shabbat and we apply it to Sukkah.
No, but
okay, that's one thing. Then he's saying also if there's a leniency in Hilchot Sukkah, such as where you're allowed to have a lot of open space and a Tzurat HaPetach, and there's not a lot of solid wall, you still will, since the Torah recognizes that as a structure, then also for Hilchot Shabbat it's going to be recognized as a structure. That's going the opposite direction. That's letting Hilchot Sukkah overpower Hilchot Shabbat.
Unless I missed something, it didn't seem as though there was such leniencies, because that leniency was only within the context of having 2 walls first, and then the Tzurat HaPetach. Right?
Okay.
Here they seem to say, well, the leniency would apply to any wall.
No, that's not really the main. The main thing is not how many walls. It's just two different situations. Just different situations. There are certain situations for Shabbat that are, like for example, if you were to have a situation where you had two walls in an L shape, where each one has a big opening door in it, and then you had a Tzurat HaPetach on the third side. Nobody's going to say that that's a valid structure, even though for Sukkah we would say it's a valid structure.
No,
but for a Mavoy,
it's a valid structure only if
on Sukkot of Shabbat.
No, but also if you
Shabbat
have walls, if you
right,
have
of
walls,
course, yeah,
it wouldn't be.
right. So the point is that each one has its own standards and leniencies, and each leniency influences the halachot of the other.
Precisely. So in other words, even within the two walls, having that Tzurat HaPetach is considered a leniency, and so that's what they're discussing.
It's still a leniency.
Only of that one wall.
Because it wouldn't count for Hilchot Shabbat. It wouldn't count for Hilchot Shabbat, so it's a leniency that we allow you to carry in there on Shabbat. Okay. Now, we move on. V'shechamata meruba mitzilata pesula. If there's more sunshine in the sukkah than shade, it's invalid. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, chamata mechamat zichuch velo mechamat tifanot. That only means that the roof provides more sun than shade. In other words, if there's not enough covering on the roof and it provides more sun gets through than shade, then the sukkah is invalid. However, velo mechamat difanot, but if the walls are made with a lot of space in them, and as a result of the space in the walls you get sunlight into the sukkah, that doesn't count. That doesn't count. We're only talking about the roof. However, Rabbi Yoshia says, Av mechamat difanot. Even the walls have to be enclosed enough that the total, we look at the tachlis, as they say, right? How much sunlight gets into the sukkah? According to Rabbi Yoshia, even if your walls, you get too many tzurot HaPetach, so lots of sunshine gets in, and you get a little bit of sunshine from the sechach, it's no good. The Chachamim said, we don't care about sunshine that comes from the side. We only care about the roof.
No, but there was no consensus reached as far as that goes. We saw.
What are we doing here now? You're going
in terms of the sunlight.
No, the Mishnah says clearly, Shechamata meruba mitzilata pesula.
So that's not part of the original discussion where at the end they said, okay, it's halach al Moshe Sinai.
No, that's about the height of walls. We didn't even get to this yet.
No, but part of the height of the walls.
That was one reason that was given for the height of the walls. But everybody agrees if that sechach wouldn't provide shade, then it's not considered covered. In other words, if it wouldn't provide shade, it's not considered covered.
Okay, so in other words, it was not.
That's not a discussion. That's not a debate.
It was only dismissed within the context.
The question
of the
just is, does it before? Does it actually have to be at a height where it's providing the shade or not?
I see. Okay.
But that's a different question. But the fact that it has to be enough sechach that were the sun shining on it, it would provide shade. That everybody agrees, right? So now the question is, do you factor in also the walls? Meaning, if there's a lot of space in the walls and the sunshine's coming through there also. Is that a pisul, in other words, is that an invalidation of the sukkah, that more sunlight gets in than shade, or is it only an invalidation of schach? Right, that's the machloket. Mm-hmm. Okay, the chachamim say it's only an invalidation of schach. We don't care if the light comes in from the side. We only care about the roof. Now, Amar Rav Yemar said, Bar Shelamya, he said, Mishmei de'abayin enem v'abayin ma'itama de Rabbi Yoshia. What's the reasoning of Rabbi Yoshia? Dechtiv, as it says, v'sakota al ha'aron et ha'parochet. It says that the parochet covers the aron. The parochet is a curtain that separates between the kodesh and the kodesh HaKodeshim. Now, parochet mechaytza v'kakarya rachmana sechacha. That even though the parochet, even though that curtain is a wall, it's a divider. Okay, it's vertical. It's not horizontal. And yet the Torah calls it a cover. Alma mechaytza kasechach. That implies that a wall is like sechach. In other words, the wall is also providing protection, not just the roof. And according to the rabbis, that teaches it's the opposite actually. That at the top of the parochet, they folded it over a little bit so that there was a little bit of a roof made from it. Right? Yeah.
That, right?
But only that part is called covering. Only something horizontal that's over you is called the covering, not a mechitza. So that's the machloket. Now, Amar Rabbi Abai says Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabban Gamliel, Ubet Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, V'acheirim, Kulo sevira lehu sukkah dirat keva ba'inan. All of these Tanaim hold that the sukkah must be a permanent structure. or meaning to say it has to be a structure that could be lived in permanently. Dirat keva ba'inan. Rabbi, how do we know that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi maintains that? The Tanya, it says in the Braita, Rabbi Omer, Kol sukkah she'in ba 4 amot al 4 amot pesula. He requires that a sukkah be 4 by 4 amot. Why is he not satisfied with 7.5 tfachim by 7.5 tfachim? Because he would say you couldn't live there. You could squeeze in there for a short time, but that's not a permanent. That couldn't be a functional residence for long term. Rabbi Yoshia, how do we know that Rabbi Yoshia maintains that the sukkah has to be dirat keva? Had because you see that he holds that the walls have to also provide protection, not just the roof, which is because he maintains that the walls also need to be a structure that is, you wouldn't live in a house that most of the walls were wide open. Even if halachically, technically it's enclosed, you wouldn't live in there regularly.
You wouldn't live in a structure that doesn't protect you from the rain either.
That's true. Rabbi Yehuda, how do we know Rabbi Yehuda maintains that a structure has to be dirat keva ditnan sukkah shigvoan lemala mikaf amap psula? Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda allows a sukkah that's taller than 20 amot because he allows or even requires a permanent structure. He says that if it's over 20 amot, that's great. That means that it's going to be a solid structure. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon says, Bet kil chatan v'gimel afilu tefach. Rabbi Shimon omer gimel kil chatan v'dalad afilu tefach. This is why Rabbi Shimon holds that you need 3 walls plus a tefach, not 2 walls plus a tefach. Why? Because he says 3 walls plus a tefach is already like a real residence. It has to be more realistic. Rabban Gamliel says, Ditanya, how says Sukato Barosha Agala or Barosha Sefina. Rabban Gamliel posel. Rabban Gamliel says that if you make your sukkah on top of a wagon or on top of a boat, it's pasul. Why is it pasul? Because it can't be permanent.
How about the sukkah that Chabad makes?
Right, exactly. So they would say, Rabban Gamliel would say that's no good. The sukkah mobile. It's not good. However, Rabbi Akiva machshir. Rabbi Akiva says it's okay, and we follow Rabbi Akiva. Okay. Beit Shammai, how do we know that Beit Shammai holds that it has to be a sukkah that is reasonable for long-term dwelling? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, Mishaya Rosh Avruba v'sukkah v'shulchana b'toch habayit. Beit Shammai postelin u'Beit Hillel machshirin. That Beit Shammai holds that the sukkah has to be big enough for not only you, but your furniture, your table to fit in as well. Unlike Beit Hillel that says as long as you can squeeze in, it's enough. And finally, Rabbi Eliezer said, "T'nan sukkah ha'oseh sukkato kimin tzarif os shesimacha lakotel." Rabbi Eliezer posel lefi she'en lagag v'chachamim machshirin. Rabbi Eliezer said that if you make your sukkah kimin tzarif, this means that it's, how do they translate tarif? I don't know. But the point is that it's made like this, that it's wide on the bottom, and it comes to, it's like a teepee.
Like a hut.
Like a hut, like a teepee. It comes to a point on top. So what, in other words, the whole thing is made out of material that's kasher for sechach, it must be. But what you did was you made it that there's no discernible roof. Okay, right. All it is it comes together like this. Right. So is that roof or wall? You know, a teepee, like they have the teepee, it's triangular. Is there which part is the wall and which part is the roof in a tent? That's like this. I don't know. It's roof, it's wall, it's the same thing. So he says that's not valid. Similarly, if he makes it on a kotel, which means to say, what he does is he takes chach and he leans it against the wall. So again, it's the same concept. There's no distinction between walls and roof. It's the same thing. So that's not something that's a long-term kind of dirah. That's something that's a temporary kind of a dwelling, and that's why Rabbi Eliezer says it's no good. The Chachamim allow it. Achirim, which is Rabbi Meir, Titanya, as we learned, Achirim omrim sukkah ha'asuya kashovach. That if you have a sukkah that's made like a shovach, pesula. The fishe'en la zaviyot. In other words, if it is round, okay, if you have a round, it's made like a dovecote. The dovecote is where the doves would live, the birds would live. It's a rounded sukkah. According to Achirim, according to Rabbi Meir, it is an invalid sukkah. Now it's going to go into the next part of Rabbi Yochanan sukkah. It's going into a whole other discussion about mathematics that we're going to do tomorrow, about geometry. But it's going to go into a circular sukkah. We allow a circular sukkah. But what's the reason why Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer, all of these chachamim hold that you can't have these various sorts of sukkot? Because they're all sukkot that a person would not consider for long-term dwelling. Nobody's going to consider for long-term dwelling a circular sukkah. It doesn't have corners. It doesn't have the tzura. It doesn't have the form of a long-term dwelling, and therefore they're not going to allow it. And the halacha that we accept, lema'aseh, is that Sukkah Dirat Arai. The Sukkah is a temporary dwelling. So all of these cases we're going to rule more leniently, with the exception of the case that we do hold, like Beit Shammai, that your Sukkah, that your table has to be in the Sukkah when you eat. You can't just have your body in the Sukkah, but the table has to be as well.